Most Americans have watched with a sense of sadness and rage as women's basketball star Brittany Griner has been put through a mock trial in Russia, having been charged with possession of a small amount of marijuana. It's been painfully obvious to us that Griner is being used as a political pawn in a renewed Cold War between Russia and the United States, as Russia's President Putin attempts to claim the Ukraine in whole or in part as a part of Russia. And the United States is arming the Ukraine in billions of dollars of sophisticated weapons, allowing them to fight a virtual proxy war for us against Russia. So Russia has played a cruel publicity game, daily dangling this innocent athlete in front of TV cameras to make the American government get on its knees and beg for her release, finally to trade, probably, a truly dangerous criminal in order to buy her way out of jail. It has been a despicable affair, and we are justly outraged by it. In my opinion, what's been missing from the media coverage has been a sense of American self-awareness of just how hypocritical it is of Americans to be upset about Russia giving a 9-year sentence to this basketball star for marijuana possession when we have thousands of Americans in county jails and state and federal prisons for marijuana violations. And mind you, the way that prosecutors get a longer sentence is they search for other things to add to drug possession. So one gentleman in his 80s that I used to visit in our local Greene County jail was arrested for selling marijuana that he grew on his farm, but they also found a shotgun that had not been fired for years in the trunk of his car. So they accused him as if he were a gangster with arms going out and peddling drugs. Even as marijuana has become increasingly decriminalized or legalized in state after state, we never seem to be able to meaningfully review our current incarcerated population to give early release and, just as importantly, to purge criminal records for these generally harmless violations. Granted, Russia's judicial system is a sham. It's a hoax. More than 90% of the people that are charged are found guilty. It's uncivilized. It's unjust. But the truth remains that the United States incarcerates a larger percent of our population than Russia does, and that our judicial system is not the global example of fairness and equality under the law that we've been brainwashed to believe that it is. Far from it. I absolutely hate the way that people make arguments from false equivalencies in any conversation about ethics. Whataboutisms are typically a logical fallacy that we call in philosophy class, as you know, we always make it Latin to make it sound more important, but it's tu quoque, which literally means, and you too, or more colloquially translates, I'm rubber and you're glue, what you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. Now, this may seem a bit off topic, but I can't help pointing out that for 6 months now, we've been filling the airways with comparisons of Putin to Hitler with every manner of condemnations of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And granted, Russia is guilty as charged, even though there have been breakaway regions on the border where most people wanted to be part of Russia, and even though Russia as a nation was actually born in Kyiv and not in Moscow, there are historical and cultural reasons for Putin's claim, not sufficient to justify invasion, not to mention all the war crimes, rape, targeting of civilians, and literally stealing children and shipping them into Russia to brainwash them into being purely Russian. Putin is, if not a Hitler, he is at least a Hitler wannabe. But it continues to be ironic to me that Russia's sins are so easy to see from this distance, but we still refuse to admit that our invasion of Iraq was an even more egregious and more illegal war than Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I can't seem to find anyone else who will admit the obvious truth that George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and even Colin Powell were war criminals. They lied to the American people. They lied to the United Nations. They destroyed a country, killing hundreds of thousands of people and plunging them into poverty without a plausible excuse. And they wasted American resources that could have more easily provided universal health care, tuition-free education for everyone, but instead we got an illegal war in Iraq. Look, I'm not the only person who knows this. In 2015, 7 years ago, the counterterrorism czar in the Bush administration, Richard Clarke, told Amy Goodwin in an interview on Democracy Now! That Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld, his former bosses, were all war criminals. That's not me. That's Richard Clarke, the czar of terrorism under the Bush administration. And we let Bush retire to his Texas bathtub where he paints pictures of his favorite pets and his old friends, like Vladimir Putin. You recall that he said of Putin, "I looked the man in his eye. I found him to be a very straightforward and trustworthy individual. He had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul, a man deeply committed to his country and the best interest of his country." I'm not saying that the USA and Russia are the same, but what I am saying is that there are so many similarities that the hypocrisy should shame us into getting our own house in order before we get too self-righteous about Russia's clay feet. I cannot think of any good reason why Bush, Cheney, Powell, and Rumsfeld were not put on trial as war criminals. But I digress. Back to Brittany Griner and America's hypocrisy about marijuana. One of the biggest disappointments I had about the Obama administration is that he never granted pardons to people charged with marijuana offenses, especially in light of the fact that Obama had been a marijuana user himself when he was a younger man. He just didn't get caught. I literally waited out the closing weeks of his administration. Some of you here remember that I talked about it, waiting with bated breath for him to grant pardons to tens of thousands of people who not only were incarcerated, but those who suffered from unemployment and homelessness, because you often can't get into public housing if you've got a drug charge against you, a host of other issues because their marijuana counts against their record made them felons. And he, Obama, never rose to the decency of showing mercy to these unjustly judged Americans. Again, Republicans have been worse on this issue than Democrats, but Democrats have not impressed me with their moral vision. This is low-hanging fruit. And it's just inexcusable that our country remains blind to the obvious truth of our excessive incarceration around drug use. And I would even say, even for harder drugs, addiction is a medical or maybe a mental health issue, but it isn't a criminal issue. And yet we keep treating addicts as criminals, giving them incarceration instead of treatment. Most of Western Europe has come to terms with this long ago, and there is no reason for the United States to hold on to an antiquated and misinformed perspective on drugs, which, by the way, cost so much more than treatment. We are not, after all, trying to follow in the steps of Iran and Russia, even though we are. Folks, the answer is treatment, not incarceration. Most of the world has known this for years. There is no excuse for the fact that we are still using prisons to punish rather than treatment centers to cure and to help addicts. Now, this is not the first time I've spoken to this topic, and let me just go ahead and say it now. It won't be the last. I will say again in future sermons that the United States does not have a justice system. We have a legal system. I can think of no case that illustrates this fact more clearly than the case of Barry Jones, who was charged by the state of Arizona with having caused the 1995 death of his girlfriend's 4-year-old daughter, Rachel Gray, who was determined to have died because of a punch to the stomach. Shoddy police work, junk science in the forensic report, and horrendous legal representation in court resulted in Jones being convicted of being the one who punched her in the stomach, causing her death, and he was sentenced to death. Now, I have no doubt that Barry Jones was not a likable character. He wasn't a professional athlete in basketball or any other sport. And I wouldn't have wanted my sister to date Barry Jones. He just didn't kill this kid. He was found guilty based on circumstantial evidence, and his defense attorney did not even review the medical report. When he finally managed to have his case retried, it was made evident that he not only was innocent of the murder, but he simply couldn't have been involved. And a lower court judge said that he should be released immediately. Now, this is where it gets weird. The state of Arizona objected and appealed it to a higher and higher court until in May of this year, it ended up in the Supreme Court. Now, the leaked statement of what the court was planning to do about Roe v. Wade took over the news, but at the same time, in early May, there was a 6-3 decision in which Justice Clarence Thomas wrote that innocence is not enough to prevent the state of Arizona from executing Barry Jones. Innocence is not enough to prevent execution. Did you hear that? The Supreme Court, that's supposed to be the pinnacle of justice in the Western world, ruled that merely not being guilty of the crime does not prevent a state from executing an innocent man. It will not surprise you that I told you that Clarence Thomas wrote the decision. However, it will also not surprise you that Justice Sonia Sotomayor said that Thomas's opinion was perverse and illogical, which of course it was. I didn't go to law school, and yet it's obvious to me. What might be less obvious is any claim that Clarence Thomas went to law school, but sadly, he shows deference to what he calls the rule of law. That is, decisions are made based on the way that the law is written rather than on the justice's opinion of what would be just. Now, Justice Sotomayor has often given public speeches defending the rule of law, saying that you want to take away a judge's personal opinions and insist that the standard be that they make decisions based on the law. And Thomas ruled in Arizona's favor, and Arizona's complaint was that the state cannot be held responsible for providing adequate legal defense for everyone that they have to provide a court-appointed lawyer for. So just because you're innocent doesn't mean that we've got to spend any money in the court process. So in almost every case, consciously or unconsciously, race, class, religion, and location play major roles in how cases are decided. I have, in fact, been arguing for years that Trump, along with most of his family and his administration, if they do not end up in prison, that we cannot say that we have equal justice under the law. I was saying that before January 6th of 2021 in the failed attempt to overthrow America's government when Trump wanted to literally install himself as a dictator. His criminal self-dealing his first year in office, using the office of the president for personal gain, emoluments, right in the beginning months of his administration, that was enough for me to see him locked up. but then trying to use military aid to Ukraine to blackmail President Volodymyr Zelensky into producing fake evidence against Joe Biden, that wasn't enough. But after January 6th, for Trump to still be walking around a free man, it isn't that it is a legal matter for me. It's an obvious miscarriage of justice. For me, if we are a nation of laws, our justice should be visible. But in this case, the case of Barry Jones, a septic tank stinks just as much, no matter whether you call sewage a rose or not. Trump is a sociopath who has delusional beliefs that he should somehow be an emperor. He is a sad little man who thinks that he is important and that the laws do not apply to him. And it would seem that Justice Clarence Thomas agrees with him. Trump, in spite of being the epitome of guilty of many crimes, in Thomas's opinion, at least according to his wife, and they appear to discuss these things at length, should still be president. And yet, Barry Jones should be executed even though he is innocent, because it is easier for Arizona to kill him than it would be to face the embarrassment of being shown how wrongly they convicted him. And that, I submit, is what is wrong with our justice system. As of this writing, Brittany Griner is still in prison in Russia, awaiting some miracle of diplomacy to be set free from an absurd conviction for a victimless crime. Also, thousands of Americans who do not play professional sports also languish in American prisons and jails on equally absurd drug charges. What is much worse, though, is that Barry Jones, a man who is innocent of the murder for which he was convicted, is now back on death row awaiting execution in Arizona because, as Justice Thomas has clearly said, in America, innocence is not enough. Whereas for the rich and powerful in America's judicial system, guilt is often not enough to even merit a criminal charge. And so at this writing, Donald Trump, his family, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, Rudy Giuliani, and many others who attempted to overthrow our government and install Trump as a dictator are still free, living the lives of millionaires. I, at least, will not gift these injustices with a silent assent, and it is my urgent hope that you will not either.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.